the Urban Big Data Center have moved up since 1 year and a half, not too long ago, from the University of Warwick in England, where I was leading the Institute for Global Sustainable Development. And I've been developing in UBDC this area on urban sustainability and participation, so a new theme we created there. The Urban Big Data Center, just briefly, is funded through the ESRC, and it's interesting because it's both a research center on new forms of data, which now have been increasingly called digital footprint data, but it's also a data service. That means that we have a mandate from ESRC to collect these new data sources, prepare them, and make them available for research. So we have a number of areas at UBDC, and I'm the deputy director of UBDC at the moment. So we have a number of areas going from housing, transport, labor market, and education, urban governance, and one of them, the theme to explore, is urban sustainability and participation. We are part of this, what is called digital footprint data infrastructure by ESRC, and provide a number of data collections in these themes. If you are interested, we encourage you to have a look. But what I will talk specifically about within this is a set of related activities to the data service, which is our project in Participatory Urban Analytics, that indeed try to bridge urban big data analytics with citizen science and participatory methods. We've been doing a number of projects in the past few years. One is just finishing this month, Tony, is the Urban Latam, which is a GCRF project, which I have the PI for. Is about landslides and community resilience in Brazil and Colombia. I come originally from Brazil, so I have a lot of research and links there. Also work with colleagues at the University of Antioquia in Colombia, in Colegio Mayor, and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro around landslides in this grant. And we have also an ongoing interest in generating urban sustainability indicators and sustainable development indicators based on new sources of data at UBDC that I'm leading. And last but not least, it's a new project we are just starting now. It's called Idea Maps, which is about participatory mapping, combining machine learning and remote sensing with participatory community engagement in the private communities, with pilot cities in Nigeria, in Lagos and Kano, and in Kenya, in Nairobi. That's a project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We started in October 2022, but it's now just taking off. I will be next week in Kenya launching the new part of this project, which is quite exciting, with an international consortium as well. So this is a bit of the background. So I've been working then, about these themes, like sustainability, sustainable development, with a strong component of looking at community engagement and resilience and multi-stakeholder engagement, multi-stakeholder governance as well. So a bit starting with this background, I will then talk a little bit about what I'm calling participatory urban analytics. Where does it come from, and what are the challenges we are majorly tackling? So first, the first key challenge is really, to think about urban research and research about cities in the era of what we've been calling digital footprints, which is really, as you know, a lot of things that we do at the moment are generating data and leaving digital footprints, things which are completely analog in the past, like, for example, this talk, it's now generating digital footprints through the Microsoft Teams and being kind of like streamed through the cables of the university, but also a lot of things we do and buy and access, in online and administrative systems produce data. This data is a kind of like a byproduct of these activities, but can also be used to understand society in different ways, That also has to do with new sensors, both in situ local sensors from CCTV cameras, drones, the remote sensors and satellites, and obviously citizen-generated data, social media, and platforms such as OpenStreetMap. All of this is generating data at an increasingly pace, and one of the challenges is how to make sense of this data for understanding society and social processes, which is qualitatively a different challenge than the traditional type of data that we use with surveys, with kind of like, more purpose-built data collection and analysis. Now we have this data which is generated for a different product, for a different process, and we want to use it. So there is a challenge, which is how to assess representativity or how to understand to what extent this is reflecting society, only a group of users, how to understand to what extent are we having kind of like a linkage between this state and social processes we are interested. So all of this is what we, broadly have called in the past the big data problem. It's a term which is both useful but also sometimes misleading. Sometimes this data is not so big, but it's still interesting, and because it has lots of gaps, and that's the other side of it, of these challenges, which is really what I've been calling looking at the urban inequalities. I think this is I'm see it completely, but what is written there is that urban social spatial inequalities are strongly associated with data inequalities. So that's the thing I always would like to bring to mind. That's no problem. I can read the titles and then we'll know them. So I bring this photo here, which is a city I'm quite familiar with, is the city of São Paulo in Brazil, and a photo that became a bit emblematic, symbolic for urban inequalities. It's in a lot of textbooks of urban geography. You can see this photo today because it has two very contrasting realities. In the left-hand side of a favela, a slum, or Paraisópolis, and the right-hand side, you have a very luxurious building where people have, swimming pools in their balconies and so on. So this is an actual place, where these things are meters apart, really, in the city. And that does kind of like point us to the need to investigate what this type of inequalities, how are they related to data? And interestingly, I bring an example of one of my research projects in the past, who has looked at social media. We were more interested in looking at to what extent can we extract information from Twitter, for example, to understand flooding and flooding impacts, which is a data source which could be tapped and potentially useful to understand risk, vulnerability, and what can be done about flooding. So we did that in São Paulo, and then started to look at to what extent social media, on the one hand, correlates with rainfall, with heavy rainfall. So we wanted to see whether we could use social media as an indicator of heavy rainfall episodes, and with this, a proxy for trying to identify flooding, it's quite a severe thing in Brazil in general, but particularly in São Paulo city, as I will tell a little bit more in a bit. But interestingly, I'll show, if I can get the slide to pass, I will show you some maps about this. Let's see, yeah. So these maps are maps of São Paulo, and it's the area of the city. You don't need to know São Paulo very well to see that it's a very radial pattern of income, which is the blue shades here. So you can see that the center is very, the wealthy areas are concentrated in the city center, and the more you go towards the periphery of the city, you have kind of like more low income areas, But the interesting thing is the relationship between these blues and the red bubbles, which is a degree to which the activity in Twitter related to rainfall is related to actual rainfall measured by a radar, So I won't go into the details. If you're interested, the paper is there how we generated this indicator. But the interesting thing I wanted to point out here is that you can see that the large bubbles, which are better data, are exactly in the wealthy areas. And the more you go towards the periphery, the bubbles are smaller. What does that mean? This means that if we look at Twitter searching for heavy rainfall, we'll have like very good coverage if we look at these areas here. but very poor coverage of rainfall if you look at the areas, the outskirts areas. So this is important because if we uncritically use this data set for monitoring flooding, what we might be doing is to looking at the flooding of the rich, but not the flooding of the poor. So that is where social spatial inequalities are associated to data inequalities. We have much better data about wealthy areas than poor areas. Yeah? So we can see the contrast in the right-hand side is population. So you see that pattern is much more scrambled and not the same. So it's really a much stronger correlation with the income. And then what does that mean is that we have to be careful in how to look at big data, but also what I will call the no data, which is the lack and the absence of data. And this is very strongly correlated with social inequalities. So if we don't pay attention to this, we might be turning data inequalities in further environmental inequalities and social inequalities if we perpetuate using biased data. So that is just kind of like a reminder of this, but it's also a motivation for a lot of my research, which is, okay, look at this two contrasting realities, the big data potentials and the lack of data. How can we combine these things? So how can we address these inequalities in data analytics so that we don't do a data analytics that perpetuate inequalities and exacerbate them? And that is the question I pose in my research. How can actually we think differently about analytics? We think about data generation, circulation, and usage as an opportunity, as much as for empowerment, as also for urban knowledge production. So these are some photos from different projects in Brazil, Kenya, and different parts of Brazil and Kenya, and that I've been doing, and asking this question, which I think is the question for what I've been calling the participatory urban analytics. Can we do analytics that at the same time is participatory and empowering, but also generates data and data analysis? And I draw inspiration from a Brazilian educator called Paulo Freire, who became famous because he wrote a book in the 70s, in the 1970s, called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a book which became quite influential in adult learning and in social pedagogy. And actually, one interesting thing about Freire's approach was that he would take literacy, which, for example, teaching reading and write skills, and actually say that we not only would teaching people read and write the word, but reading and write the word is also to read and write the world. So we have to see literacy embedded in a critical consciousness. That's what Freire would propose. And I brought this to data, and then we're really thinking about, okay, how can we think about a data pedagogy? Can you think about data as an opportunity to learn and to think critically and to ask questions about the territory, not only to have answers, but also to ask new questions, So we're focusing on these three activities or data practices of data usage, generation, and circulation as pathways for social change and also for building citizenship, especially thinking of marginalized communities and how really they relate to data and how a relationship to data can be built that can be empowering. So that is a bit of the approach that we've been constructing along a number of projects. And what I would like to show is a bit how we apply this approach in a specific project to make it a bit more concrete now. And this project is so-called Waterproofing Data Project. This provocative title, Waterproofing Data, is because when we started it, we had a look at the big issue of flood resilience and flooding is, as you know, problem worldwide, also in the UK. We had an international consortium with partners in the UK at the University of Warwick and the University of Glasgow. In Brazil, the National Early Warning Center and the FGV, which is a local university, and University of Heidelberg in Germany. And we realized the three countries had flooding, but also how can we relate to data differently to really build flooding resilience, really build resilience. So the question we posed was this one: how to rethink flood data production and flow to enable transformations to build sustainable flood resilience communities. So we took a more transdisciplinary approach in which we had kind of like a huge team, a very multidisciplinary, ranging from environmental scientists, meteorologists, and hydrologists from the National Early Warning Center in Brazil, up to computing and data people, and ranging to also humanities and scholars and arts-based methods. So we did that for 3 years, from September 2018 to June last year. We finished this, about a month, 1 year ago. And I would like to tell a little bit of how we approach this problem of flooding and of community resilience. So the starting point was to look kind of like of what is the role of data. So for really doing transformation. So we did kind of like a paper. It's a bit of a busy slide here, but just wanted to show that it is, we did a review to start about how people were thinking that data could be linked to transformations that could build resilience. And when we noticed that, that the stronger focus on data usage, is data improving decision making, which we call referential function of data be used as a reference. But actually, there are other ways, other functions of data that can be explored so that data can construct resilience. For example, you can think about the circulation of data and use this as an opportunity to build resilience. You can think about data generation itself and use this as an opportunity to build resilience. So we decided to explore those in the project and really build our research in really trying to explore a broader view of data, or how data can be linked to resilience. So this was done by 3 main objectives, really. First is really how do we make visible how different stakeholders engage with data, how do we engage citizens to produce data, and how to integrate data. We worked in 3 scales, we can say, like in communities in Brazil, in 2 cities, in São Paulo and Rio Branco, with local governments, city governments, and with centers of expertise, like the National Early Warning Center, that was a partner in our consortium as well. So from this, we would like to see data flowing between these different scales, and then thinking about these 3 objectives across them. And we came up with something that we call the dialogic mode for doing data innovations. So how do we construct innovations that try to embed these different pathways in a more participatory project? So inspired by the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, we started with a situational analysis here. So trying to see what is data about flooding today? How is it used? Who is using that? So grounding in lived experiences and meaningful things for people. Then we try to look what is the generative data? What is really data that makes a difference? Paulo Freire would use the term generative words, that are words that really have meaning for people. And then he would, do literacy campaigns, not starting with the words I choose, but really with words from the universe of the people who are being, who are going through the literacy programs. So if they're working in construction, it will be bricks. That's a generative word, And then for us, it was about what are the generative data about flooding, So that was the first question. What can engender new understandings? And then build critical consciousness, really, change perspectives and behaviors, And this leads to identify what Paulo Freire would call limit situations, really unsustainable pathways that are being perpetuated now. And with this, uncovering what Paulo Freire called the feasible unseens, things that are feasible, we can do to improve resilience, but haven't been tested, haven't been tried out, haven't been seen yet. So that's what we did, and then we generated these 3 methodological innovations I would like to briefly summarize with this approach. So a lot of abstract and theory here. Now coming to the concreteness of what we did might help to understand. So the first thing is really we engaged in data production with people, really. And we did this using various methods, from participatory mapping using OpenStreetMap. So we developed a new tool called SketchMap tool, in which people can do sketch maps, and also we can take a photo, and this can be digitized back as areas of flood risk perception, for example. So we did that in schools. We did some collaborative risk perception mappings, but we also did citizen science with school students, in which they kind of like constructed these plastic bottles rain gauges and measured rain, and then started to understand the correlations between the amount of rain and the impact of rain, to flooding, so that this could be, could make it tangible to them what flooding means and what is related to flood resilience locally. And then we also did kind of like what we call digital flood memories. We did circles of memories with elderly people who weren't as tech savvy as the kids to use the kind of like open maps and the digital maps, but which we then kind of like, did memory circles with them, did oral histories, and really tried to capture these memories and circulate them more widely with data as well. So all of this, we synthesize saying that we're moving from a data gathering approach to a data gardening. So changing the metaphor could help here. So instead of, really doing an extractive way of gathering data from others, is really cultivating data with them. And that makes a difference. So that's what we call the data gardening method. So with this, we generated opportunities to scale up. And one of them was the so-called waterproofing data app. So based on this participatory process, we identified the need for communities to record their realities. So we did a participatory design, software design process to develop a new app that would allow them to record this, and not only to record the amounts of rain they were measuring in the citizen science projects, but also the flood episodes. And this was useful not only for the communities, but also for the National Early Warning Center, because this information, localized, very granular, in space, is a very hard one to get, especially for a country like Brazil, which is a fairly big place, in which you don't have a very strong, network of sensors. So this will be creating a new observation network in which citizens could record their realities in the app, think differently about these realities, but also communicate this to the National Early Warning Center. So we developed this. This is all in Portuguese, but you can get a bit of the flavor of the app. It's a simple one. It's just it's a pedagogical tool. It is embedded into a process for people to really understand their realities differently. And they record, for example, flood areas, rainfall episodes, rainfall measures, and river level measures. That is what the functionalities we had. And with this, there is a teacher's guidance. And then we started a project which we called pollination. So another, metaphor trying to say, like, now that we develop something in our gardens, we need to bring those seeds to other places. And we kind of like seconded school teachers and civil defense volunteers to be part of our co-design process to bring this approach to a wider set of schools. So we actually worked with 21 schools, 21 pollinators in 5 Brazilian states. Brazil is quite a large place, so we wanted to capture a bit of the diversity in the different regions of Brazil. And so we went from the north in Amazon region in Rio Branco up to south Santa Catarina, and had kind of like this pollinator spread. And interestingly, the response was even bigger than we actually expected. We had, this is the map of the usage of the app, which is already outdated, but continues to be used, and we have even more. So we had more than 400 citizen scientists registered in the app, 7,500 reported records, and 43 partner schools and civil protection agents in all of these places in the map on the right side here. So they've been using the app, producing new data, and doing things with the app after our pollination process. That took off by a number of factors, also because there was some strong flood episodes within the process that we are pollinizing, and this became quite kind of like widespread and known. Media picked it up. There was kind of like a large coverage in kind of like national broadcasting, TVs, newspaper in Brazil, and this project kind of like, you know, spread quite interestingly in different places in Brazil. But one of the things that we did in order to kind of like give visibility of this is also to develop a dashboard, which is kind of like a tool for people to monitor in real time different contributions of this observation network. So they can, you know, it's a simple visualization dashboard that you can click the number of a city or location, and with this choose there, and it will show who the amount of millimeters of water that people are measuring there, how many active observation or citizen scientists in that area, and we'll build some graphs about rainfall, measured rainfall by kind of like official measures, but also by citizens and this type of thing. So that helped a lot for people to get a monitoring of their, or allow people to monitor their, you know, their observation, the local observation networks that were being created through our app. So interestingly, so to conclude this case, you know, I like to tell this story because it became quite almost a natural experiment, you know, unwanted, but, you know, interesting in a way, sad in another way, that happened, you know. One of the areas we've been working in the northeast of Brazil, called Jaboatão dos Guararapes, near Recife, had in May last year, in fact, it's 1 year since just today, so 1 year ago, in 31st of May, a catastrophic flooding, really. So more than 91 dead, as you can see here, especially concentrated in vulnerable areas. And that happened after we had done the pollination and the kind of like the mobilization with the local stakeholders there. And then we came back to really look at, you know, obviously to look how they work, but also to look at, you know, whether the app or using this tool could have helped, you know, in the situations that they were passing through. And it was quite interesting because we looked at this dashboard I was showing, and we could see that indeed it has been used and to record the rainfall even after we finished the project, actually. And they continued recording and had this peak, which was on 28th of May last year, you know, which was exactly the day of the catastrophe. And we realized some young citizen scientists, you know, who have been trained, they were realizing it and continuing measuring. So we asked if the civil defense coordinator, whether this made a difference or whether, you know, what did they do with that? And we saw that they also did kind of like an alert through the app. They can generate, you know, community alerts. And the alert said, you know, this area has flooding because it is, you know, increasing millimeters of rain. Alert situation. And interestingly, this civil defense agent who was our pollinator told us that in this community, which we have worked, you know, the community mobilized and moved to safer grounds, you know, just because they were seeing, you know, they were conscious that this amount of rain that would lead to something was imminent, you know. So they moved to safer grounds, and actually no one died in those communities, and very different from the communities, you know, around it. So this showed us that really there is here that basic assumption, you know, is an anecdotal evidence, but it shows that, you know, differently from the other communities, this particular community, because we have had the data mobilization and the conscientization process, they acted differently, and this contributed to their resilience, and in fact saved lives in this occasion, which was quite encouraging. So to wrap up my talk and then you know, open up with some discussion, some concluding thoughts, you know. So first, you know, a very brief summary. I just told about the data gathering, pollination. This project generated a number of other things, you know. Obviously, the data focus on these two, data gathering and what we call the dialogical data stories, which is, you know, mobile app data pipelines and dashboards. But we also generated, you know, some interesting tools for participatory mapping. As I was saying, like with the sketch map tool, which is now actually launched and being used by a lot of humanitarian organizations as well. And the method, an ethnographic method to look at data called data diaries, which, I didn't have space to cover here, but, if you're interested, glad to discuss. And a summary, the way we're trying to summarize this kind of like new way of dealing with data was to look that data could open different pathways, really, So usually we think of data, as decision making. But what we are seeing in this project is that data could be used in different ways to build resilience. The first one is to develop critical consciousness. Really people think differently about their territories so that they can do differently and build local resilience. The second is that filling data gaps. These observation networks were producing data about areas which were not monitored. And then these would fill kind of like this gap and democratize decision making. The second is establishing connection. As I said, the local communities could talk to civil defenses, and that kind of like changed the way they reacted when there was a situation imminent, and they really could take preventative measures. They mobilized to action and reimagine social ecologies. That means that they were bringing more people to the action of flood resilience, but also thinking differently about what is flooding through, for example, flood memories and hearing from others and visualizing this in different ways. And I think, in the end, what this leads is really for us to think about a more democratized decision making. The data is not only flowing to the top-down structures and to kind of like to this centers of monitoring, as very usually is done in analytics, but actually data is also locally relevant for people to take that decision making and take measures. So with this, my last slide, I think, what I think, what I wanted to bring is this kind of like example of how we are thinking about participatory analytics, about thinking of data more broadly. But also, I think, the end point is opening up new questions, I think, which, I'm very keen to explore. So first, if we perhaps were thinking about reversing or changing the perspective around urban analytics. So there was a lot of focus on big data and looking at data for policy. I think this is still relevant, but we have also to think about how data can be inclusive and transformative. So we think about inequalities and how does that relate to data and how do we start to address that, for example, in these pathways I described. And last but not least, questions around how to leverage these urban analytics as an opportunity for social learning and empowerment of citizens, was also to generate some evidence to inform public policy. So I think this is kind of like the what the outlook of this work has been, is really pointing out to looking at urban analytics more embedded and grounded and combining this with participatory methods. So I'm quite keen to explore, and I'm doing this in a number of future projects as well. Yes, so I think that's it for me today. So thanks a lot for your attention. I would be glad to take questions if there are any.
Thank you. So yeah, if we have any questions in the room, obviously feel free to stick your hand up. I'm going to turn off my email so it doesn't keep beeping. I forgot to do it earlier. So. Yes, Heather and Izzy in the room. You can fight if you want to decide who goes first.
I was interested in the data gardening,
right,
and the different methods that you chose. We've used quite a lot of participatory methods in be interested to hear more about that as well. But I was just interested in how you chose those particular methods, and were you trying to target particular groups, or what was the rationale behind that? Thanks.
Yeah, very good question. Exactly. So the idea of having a set of methods was to try and cover, different parts of the community, And we realized, for example, we had elderly people, we had young citizens, we had teachers, and we wanted to really diversify our portfolio of methods so that we could have not only engage the different groups, but also engage them with themselves, or make data circulate. And that was exactly the idea, So we started with the memories. because this has been quite interesting to understand both the trajectories of those communities, but also for people to think critically about why do we have floods here? You know, what does it mean that we are living in a marginalized area that was constructed in a floodplain? You know, and interestingly, this came from the stories that were told by, you know, elderly community members who was saying, when we came here, this was actually, you know, all a bit muddy, and, you know, and then we could already kind of like see those stories coming. And from these, we moved to kind of like, okay, how do we engage the younger generations now? And then the app and the citizen science. And that was kind of like, you know, the way we slowly constructed kind of like the portfolio of methods that we are doing. And I think, you know, that was basically the rationale for choosing those methods. It's really trying to reach more parts of the community and also put them in contact to each other.
Izzy?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really interested in the way that you're going to engage with policymakers and people who are making the decisions, and how you're going to feed the data coming from the local level upwards.
Yeah.
And your kind of thoughts on that.
No, that's a great question. There are a couple of ways in which we have engaged with policymakers here. It's always like a tension, isn't it? You know, because you have a bottom-up approach, you want to engage community and empower them. And sometimes there are tensions, you know, between the interests of the marginalized communities and policymakers, right? So in this project in particular has been facilitated by one key factor that we had the National Early Warning Center in Brazil as a partner, co-producing the results, you know. So they were on board from the beginning and co-designed the method. So in a way, the data that we are producing is flowing directly to them, and they are using it to monitor, you know, the flooding or to improve early warning. Both kind of like improve monitoring, day-to-day monitoring, but also improve in the long run, improve models, you know. So that is one way that, you know, is flowing into policy in a way, policy and practice. So the other thing that we have observed is that in a lot of these pollinators, you know, in this, our facilitators locally, they took the data that was collected by the communities and brought it to local authorities, you know. So I've seen this happening in a number of those cities. And then people saying like, look, these areas flood every time there is a flooding. And even if it's every time there is a heavy rain, even if it's not a very strong rain, and it still floods, you know. So there is a problem here. So they had evidence, material evidence with the data that they were collecting to show this. And they claimed kind of like, with these advocated for better, you know, for improvements. And it did, at least we have testimonies for some of them. We collected some impact evidence that in some cases it did work, and the policy and the decision makers did react to that and really, you know, did remediation measures, because this was a situation that was clearly, you know, very problematic, you know. So I think these are some of the ways we are trying to do. So really empowering local solutions to come to the forward, you know, and that's so we don't tackle flooding as a kind of like a top-down approach. You know, we really think about what does it mean now that we understand differently flooding, we understand what is happening in a different way because we collected the data, we engage with it, we think differently. What to do? What should we do? You know, so really thinking that the pathways need to be grounded in local solutions.
I'm going to go online and then I'll come back to you. So we had a question online from Michael. You had your hand up, Michael. So.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Just thank you, Professor, for going over that. It's really interesting, and it's also interesting for me. I'm doing quite a similar topic, although I'm not nowhere near as far as you. I just got a question on about scaling up with the model, because when I was listening to your presentation, I'm assuming, so I understand that you have this app and that you have this interface where people can use this to input data about the flood in their local area, where that's the rainfall, etc. And then you can then use that data to probabilistically predict how flooding can impact that area in the future. but you mentioned about how the model can predict areas where citizen scientists have not been present. I was wondering, how are you doing that? How's the model doing that? Is it learning the patterns in the data that has been recorded and then projecting that onto areas that it hasn't learned from?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great question. Well, the short answer to that is that it's not yet doing this, but that is the target. Obviously, as you point out, a big challenge here is, for the model to be meaningful, we need critical mass of data, right? And that is what will lead us to really be able to construct a meaningful predictive model here, right? So to really observe. So for now, what we are doing, that is the goal, or the more medium-term goal. Like if we continue scaling this up and doing kind of like enlarging this monitoring network, this citizen science monitor network, we will be able to do this. But at the moment, we are not doing this. At the moment, what we are doing is two things. So one is the scaling up the observation network. So we now have, this has been quite interesting as well. We have like a lot of local initiatives which are taking this to other schools, especially trying, and there is an objective of the National Early Warning Center there in Brazil to bring this to every school in a flood-prone area, this approach here. And that would really, start to address generate what we need in terms of critical mass data to be able to do more predictive modeling, right? But for the moment, the data has been more used for this like local pedagogical activities and for monitoring, really, so really looking at what's going on at the moment there, in the places which we have data. But at the moment, we are not yet extrapolating from this to areas for which we don't have data.
Right, thank you. Thanks.
Shisha, do you have a question?
Thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. When you showed that picture of the difference between more wealthy and underprivileged, kind of like related to what happens back home in Zambia. And usually, people will move to wealthier areas because they want to be close to like their place of work or things like that. So there's something more important that people think that the more important reason why people want to settle in a particular area. And we've had resistance from communities like that, and in fact from areas where they've been offered like a better place to live, and they just really want to be there closer to and I just wanted to find out, like from your experience, how this influence behavior and that decision in such a situation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Indeed, it's a complex project. It's a complex problem, isn't it? Like because flooding in cities are so intrinsically, connected. Flooding and different areas of cities, but there is this compounded, factors of, people live in areas in which they can have closer access. A lot of the people living in marginalized areas work in the wealthy areas. And indeed they are close to work, and that's why they live there. But some of these areas are flood prone. So I think there is no general answer to that, really. In my case, that's why I really think what our approach has been is that let's understand the situation so that we can think about what is meaningful to do locally. I do think that in some cases there's no other option but to move from there. But that is perhaps the worst and the kind of like last resort. Usually what we try to do is upgrading infrastructure. I liked a lot. I was working the other day in Medellin in Colombia. In a landslide prone area. With community member. And after we did our activities, he said it very eloquently. He said, you call us a high risk area, but we are actually a high cost area for you. So you can make us lower risk. Actually, we are not high risk, we are high cost. for you, and that's what he was telling the municipality, So I think there will be situations in which this is the case. And this, for me, would be the preferable way, let's integrate the areas which today are called slums or marginalized areas, which, 1 billion people living in those areas around the world, estimatedly, and let's integrate those areas, make them livable, and, work with grounded local solutions to do that, and with these reduce flood impacts and flood risk, really, by reducing vulnerability, But there will be areas for sure in which there is no way, just because the probability is so high or the costs are, prohibitive, then there will be the need to do local solutions that our community also, that community is engaged with, that will kind of like, it could include relocating to other areas. But, what a lot of these studies have shown is that relocation is really, traumatic. It sometimes changes a lot the way the community relates to itself, to themselves and the livelihoods. And there's a lot of things to consider that we have to be very careful about.
And maybe just one last on the data. I noticed you have 4 different data sets that on that app.
Yeah.
One that if there was certain types of data that were easier to collect than others. The water level, for example, the river level, I would imagine.
Yes, these 4 data types came out of a participatory design process in which really, both the community and the authorities said this was good, this is data we need, But indeed, the river level, we have 2 ways of reporting in the app. One is because sometimes there are rulers, linemetric rulers, and then people can just observe and report. So that is pretty precise. And the other one is more qualitative, which is just looking at the level and people high, medium, low, and this kind of things, Obviously, from a kind of like modeling perspective, the rulers and the kind of like, the more you have people engaged in it, and kind of like understand the purpose of the data, then there will be, more pathways into the data for modeling and for usage and for evidence, right? So I think that is perhaps what we are doing differently from a lot of citizen science projects I've seen, The approach here is really to engage citizens embedded in the project and really think of this as part of a pedagogical process, really, and not really just mass distribution of the app to everyone and then mining later the data. Is about really working with the citizens from the beginning and they understanding why the data is being collected and what for, and that makes the kind of like the production of data more useful for a number of purposes.
Any other questions? Yeah, one down there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. So I am part of a project called the Climate Forest Project where we try to identify trees in the urban area and then link it to some other social data. My role on the project is to use machine learning using computer vision to identify trees in urban areas and link them to them. So what I've done is I have results. I've created an app that you can click on a particular county or council and then get the number of trees in there and see how the number of trees are linked to some data like the proximity of those trees to buildings, to railways, roads, and all that.
Right.
But then the next phase of the project, we are moving to other places like Falkirk, Clackmannanshire, in this area, and we want to bring in other social data sets so we can map to this tree cover. We want to see how trees are affecting, or maybe how the number of trees in a particular area is linked to social status, and how it's linked to any other, like, heat waves and how it's affecting people and all that. And I think I found out that this data gathering and data gardening thing is a very important tool. And the next thing I want to propose is to the tool. My question is I want to know if there's a documentation on how to, first of all, identify these pollinators in the community.
Yes.
And see if we can bring that on board into the project to start gathering other data that we don't have yet and see how we can link that to what I have done so far.
Yes. No, sure. We have in fact, describing the pollination process and the overarching approach. We have a preprint paper, which is in the final phases of review, so should be coming out very soon. But we have the preprint I can show you, so if I can send you. So send me an email, we can exchange contacts, and I'm glad to send you. I think you're right. So, like, I think what I would say, in that regard is this thing. So a lot of projects, for example, in another project we are doing, it's about using machine learning on remote sensing, similar to what you're doing, but to identify slums, precisely the areas which are more deprived, in Nairobi in Kenya. That's one ongoing project I have now. But one of the things that I found important is the gardening principle, which is really, we can engage citizens to know more about the areas, but it is about, bringing them on board with a process for them to be part of the knowledge construction, So that is what I think is the data gardening, because a lot of the tools have been a bit extractive in thinking about, okay, we can have people clicking and saying yes or no to, is it a tree or not, or is it right or not, or complementing this with other information that they collect, but without thinking about their perspectives and how is this meaningful for them? How can this activity be meaningful for the people who are being engaged? And I think that is the principle behind this. It's really the gardening is, okay, how can this be also something that is meaningful for them? And then with this generates data that's useful for flood monitoring, but it's also useful for them. So that has been, a lot of what we've been doing. So very glad to share.
Thanks. So we're almost at past, so I think we'll finish up, let people get away and let Joe go away as well. If you do have any questions or you want to speak to Joe later, I think your next you've got a meeting after this. Yes. It finishes at 3:30.
Yes.
So yes, we're going to go for a coffee, probably in Stirling Court Hotel, for a coffee, because a lot of them shut in the main atrium at 2:30. If anyone wants to come and join us. So we'll be just outside this room, if you do want to come for a coffee, but 3:30. So, but yeah, this leaves me to thank Joe for coming across from Glasgow and for a really interesting talk. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone else for coming. So.